He's Henry Gomez, an advertising strategist with over 20 years of experience.
And he's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief. And together we're the Brief Brothers, having an ongoing discussion about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising in general. Well, Howard, here we are again, another episode. And we were talking offline about brand promise. And brand promise is something that's important to a brief writer, because if he doesn't understand or she doesn't understand the brand that she's writing the brief for, then that brief is going to be kind of destined or doomed to fail. So what are your kind of thoughts on brand promise? I know I have my own.
Yes, Henry, I think it's a great topic. It's something I encounter very often when I'm doing training for the ANA. And I like to ask a question that doesn't seem directly about brand promise, but really is. It's called the Albert Einstein challenge that I do with my workshop. Albert Einstein was a brilliant guy. One of my favorite sayings was, if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it yourself. So I ask my participants to substitute the word "it" in that sentence for their brand. So if you don't understand your brand, if you can't explain your brand to a 6-year-old, how can you understand it? And when we do this exercise, what ends up happening too often is that the participants will describe the category in which the brand exists, but not the brand itself, because they don't have a clear understanding of what their brand promise is. And I encounter this week after week, workshop after workshop, and it's a little scary.
I bet that in addition to describing the category, they probably all have a different vision. Even if they're working on the same brand, they probably have a different vision for what that is. And that is, symptomatic of a weak brand, that the people that work on it, that are the marketers that work on that brand, don't have a unanimous view of what that brand promise is. One of my mentors, Professor Mark Ritson, he talks about this in depth in his courses. I've taken 2 of them. And, brand promise, just like a lot of things in marketing or advertising, has many names. We could talk about brand essence. We talk about brand positioning. But his tenets for brand promise are: keep it really simple, right? You at most have 3 brain cells in the consumer's mind that you can occupy. It's like, be very choosy about what 3 things you want to put there. That there's all of these kind of frameworks, and I think we've all seen these pyramids, these bullseyes, all of these, and he firmly believes, and I agree with him, that the more complex you make the branding exercise, the less likely it is to work or to mean anything to anyone. The most effective brands have very simple, easy to read brand promises that consumers intuitively understand, even if they don't articulate them in those exact words, and they exercise consistency. And I think it's important, because before you can sit down and write a creative brief, you have to have that understanding of the brand.
Absolutely.
So sometimes when you win a new account, you have to get in there, find out what that is. And if it's not clearly defined, you kind of have to backtrack, because the client is asking for a new campaign. But then you have to go and say, hey, before I give you the campaign, we got to really align on what is it that we're all about? What is our proposition to consumers? Because I have my view of what it could be, but that might not be what has been accepted at the higher levels of your company, much less throughout the whole workforce. A lot of these organizations have tens of thousands of employees. And the reality is, everybody should know the company they're working for, like what it means and what it stands for. But sadly, it's a sad state of affairs that in this day and age, a lot of people don't know exactly what they're about.
Exactly. I think there are a couple of companies out there, and we've talked about them before, where everyone is inculcated in what the brand promise is. Nike is one of them. Burger King is another. I mean, these are brands that have been unafraid to stay the same, to be steadfast in their positioning and in what they promise. And we always go back to the same ones: Burger King, Nike, Apple, and there are, Ford. There are a handful of them. One of the other things that I like to talk about in my training is an acronym that we're all familiar with. It's called KISS, K-I-S-S. Keep it simple, students. This is a family training. So the idea is that we have this remarkable capacity to take a simple idea and complicate the heck out of it. And we often do it to our own detriment. And sometimes when they're doing that Albert Einstein exercise that I put them through, they may be able to describe their brand, but they can't do it to a level of a 6-year-old. It's so complicated that they can't bring it down into that simple everyday language. Now, I realize that most brands don't have a 6-year-old as the primary audience, but that's not the point of the exercise. It's about keeping things simple.
They have consumers that have the attention span of a 6-year-old and that have a million other brands competing for that attention. Right. So I think it's a great analogy, and it also speaks to the jargon that marketers fall into, using and constantly changing, cutting edge, innovative solutions, all of these things that are not the prize. They're distractions from the prize, I think. And it frankly make the job of the brief writer more difficult. So
yes, absolutely. In fact, I think what we need to emphasize here is that when we're trying to get marketers and brief writers to be articulate about what the brand promise is, remember to do it in everyday conversational language. Keep the business and marketing jargon out of the brief. The best, most brilliant, most inspiring briefs, in my experience, have none of that kind of language. It's conversation.
Absolutely. And I think that it's also a warning to brief writers that if you don't have a clear idea of the brand promise from the client, it's up to you to pull the emergency brake on that train and stop and say, guys, this would work so much better if we all had agreement on what this basic promise is about this brand. I think a lot of people don't have the courage to pull that emergency brake.
I agree with you 100% there, Henry. It is a scary thing to say, I don't know, or I'm not sure. But a brief writer can't go into the process of writing a brief in any kind of doubt. It has to be a document that takes a position. You got to be able to defend that position. You got to be able to upset people who may not agree with you, because it's not about appealing to everybody. It's about really getting to the core of your brand.
Yep, agreed. All right, good stuff, Howard.
All right, sorry we agreed so much, but it happens sometimes. All right, Henry, let's switch topics now and talk about our creative review. And today we're going to take a look at some new logo treatments by Burger King and General Motors, both of which presented some treatments within the recent weeks. And what are your thoughts on what you see from these two legacy brands?
I think it's fascinating, changing logos or visual identity is very perilous, potentially for brands. In the case of GM, I think they've been widely panned for their new logo. They kind of went from this uppercase GM in a box to a kind of a new treatment of the box with a lowercase GM. To me, it's reminiscent of what I thought of was the Goodwill logo, which is a box with a lowercase g with a kind of smiley face. In General Motors' case, I don't think it matters that much. I think that they're really a parent company more than a brand. I think most people's affiliation or association with General Motors is with their sub-brands like Cadillac or Chevrolet. Those are where the true branding is occurring. I mean, General Motors had that same logo for decades. I remember my 1980 Cutlass Supreme had that little, square GM logo. It's very small on the vehicles. So I don't think in their case it's that important. In Burger King's case, it's interesting because their new logo is actually an old logo. In around 1999 or 2000, I think they came out with the logo that they've been using up till just now, which was basically a modernized version of their old logo. And what I've seen is generally when you modernize a logo, it becomes outdated quicker than the original, because you're using a font that's very in fashion. You're using a type of art direction, which is in fashion, and it's a fashion. So those things end up going out of fashion. So what you end up with is this 2000 era Burger King logo that kind of feels dated and old. And now they've gone to a legacy logo like from the 70s and 80s, which I think we all recognize as being a Burger King logo, and the one that most recent logo was kind of a modern version of. So it's kind of a convoluted way of saying, if you have legacy, embrace it. What I'm looking for in a fast food restaurant is for the restaurant itself to be modern and clean. But if your logo is kitschy and old, there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that brands should embrace their history.
When I see this kind of an exercise, it always prompts the question to me: what were they thinking? What is the purpose? What am I getting out of this? What is the gain? And to your point, I don't see the gain for GM, but I also agree with you. I don't think it's going to hurt them as much. I smiled when I looked at the new Burger King logo, because it did remind me. There's a bit of nostalgia attached to that older brand, and it is an embracing of something that existed before for a legacy brand. But it always, I have to wonder what some of these marketers and some of these brand folks are thinking about when they take a risk. This is a huge risk. GM's got more at stake, I think, than Burger King, but it is a huge risk to sacrifice something that exists. You've got equity. And are you throwing that equity out the door, or are you enhancing it? It's a gamble.
Yeah, agreed. I think the great case study in that is Tropicana. Tropicana, I want to say it was around 2009. They did a whole, new packaging design, new logo. And if you look at the two side by side, and we'll put them up, there's no doubt that the new version at the time was more elegant, it was more contemporary, but it also felt more generic. And it turned out that consumers, and this is a fast velocity consumer good, they didn't recognize their preferred brand on the shelves, and so they went to the next one. They went to Minute Maid or whatever, because they didn't recognize Tropicana anymore as Tropicana. The juice inside the box didn't change, but sales plummeted. So that could only be attributed to the change in design. The analogy I use is, if we're at a party where we both came in separate cars and we decide to go to another party across town and you don't know how to get there, I say, follow me. It's up to me to drive slowly, carefully, not run red lights, not make, drastic, change 3 lanes at once, because I'm going to lose you. And I think marketers forget that consumers are kind of trailing them. And if you make too many sharp turns or run yellow lights or red lights, you're going to leave the consumers behind. I think the Tropicana example is a good example of that.
This too is another example of the marketer thinking that he knows who the customer is, or thinking of himself as the customer, and not putting him or herself in the customer's actual shoes. That's the big danger. It's not about you. It's about what the customer wants.
Absolutely. Another example that occurs to me about a slight modification in the brand identity was Johnny Walker. So yeah. Johnny Walker hired BBH way back when, and they did a whole brand assignment for them, which they needed to, building off our earlier discussion about brand promise, they came up with the brand promise for Johnny Walker. They said, you know what? We're looking at the history of Johnny Walker the man and Johnny Walker the brand over the ages. It's about personal progress. And so they built the entire brand, and that's where the keep walking comes from. But they realized something that was counterintuitive, was that the striding man, who was then and now the kind of the emblem of the brand, was striding from right to left. And in Western culture, that's kind of backwards. We read from left to right. We read equations. We read text. For us, the natural thing is to go from left to right. So they just inverted the Johnny Walker. I don't think any consumers probably noticed, but it did kind of take away this incongruency in the brand that they were trying to build. So I think evolution rather than revolution when you're changing visual language. Don't leave the consumers behind. Tropicana ultimately had to go back to their original packaging. That's how much of a failure that whole thing was. But getting back to Burger King, one quick thing. One of the things that I really admire about the current regime at Burger King is their ability to go back to what worked before, even if it was before their current tenure. This going back to kind of an older style Burger King identity that we have nostalgic feelings for, I think it's the right decision. And I think it's very humble of them to say, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Like, this brand exists in people's minds in a certain way. Why are we going to fight against that?
Fearlessness. They are fearless. So I think that's a great way to wrap this up, Henry. So he's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach, and together we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.